So the Coldplay Kiss Cam couple are now a global phenomenon, as most of us are familiar with. The Straits Times of Singapore, for example, reports CEO of tech firm placed on leave after viral Coldplay Kiss Cam clip prompts internal probe. An opinion piece in the Malaysia Star says, as the Coldplay Kiss Cam couple fades into the bushes, here's what the internet hath wrought. NDTV in India reports what Coldplay's Kiss Cam tells about today's social media surveillance. And people are already starting to reenact the episode on kiss cams at sporting events as a new meme sweeping the popular culture. And if you don't know about it because you're holier or more contemplative than the rest of us, and I don't say that ironically, at major music or sporting events, they have this thing called the Kiss Cam, where couples in the audience will be featured on the big screen with the expectation that they will kiss. And at a recent Coldplay concert, a couple was apparently innocently featured, only to have them run for cover as soon as they noticed that all the eyes were on them, revealing that they were actually having an affair. And now they've become the laughingstock and subject of ridicule for the entire world. Like, imagine getting caught for something embarrassing by just a few people you know, and how mortifying that experience would be. That's the kind of thing that people go into serious dark depression over. But now imagine that you've been exposed to the entire world, that you're infamous everywhere because the viral nature of the internet places a higher premium on scandal and intrigue than it does on actual justice and moral accountability. I doubt any of us can even begin to imagine, let alone comprehend, how devastating this situation they find themselves in is. And I know some people will say, well, they got what they deserved. And yes, I'm not trying to downplay the seriousness of their transgression, which I hope this video will make clear as I develop my arguments. But I also know that we've all done things that we would be horrified to be exposed for. Imagine your most embarrassing moral mistake or moral failure, and then the added misfortune of that moment being caught and exposed for billions of people to denounce in order to distract from their own sins. All of which is to say, for those of us who are people of prayer, I think we should pray for them. We should pray that this is a moment in which grace exceeds the sin that they were exposed for and its consequences, and that God can make good use of the extravagance of their shame for the good of their souls and perhaps that of our culture. So in that spirit, I wonder if there's something we can all learn from their misfortune, something better than the collective opportunity to all point and laugh or point and ridicule, because extreme portrayals of moral lessons are sometimes necessary for us to extract the wisdom that can be gained from them. That's why we have fairy tales, for example. They amplify the moral lessons of a story in order to make them more obvious for us onlookers who are so compromised that we will miss it if it's any more subtle than that. So what can we all learn from the tragedy of the Kiss Cam? I think one of the most potent lessons is in what their reaction says about our own human nature, because it's their reaction that exposed them, not the camera and not the audience or the concert venue or anything like that. If they had just played it cool and gave each other a little kiss, then the camera would have moved on to someone else and nobody would have suspected anything. But they didn't. And they couldn't. As soon as the camera was pointed in their direction and they knew it, their unrehearsed reaction, their first instinct was to run and to hide. They saw themselves as in a kind of fairy tale mirror and were horrified at what it showed them. The pretense and the facade that they had erected had been exposed for what it was. They weren't retreating from the judgment of the audience because the audience had no idea that their relationship was illicit. They were retreating from themselves and their own guilt and shame, which they obviously carried around with them like a liability that you try to ignore, but always knowing that at some point it could come back to bite you. And in this case, it did. Like, who were they hiding from? Their spouses weren't at the concert, presumably, otherwise they wouldn't have been acting like that. Nobody in the audience knew who they were. Again, they could have just played it cool, at ease with their own decisions and actions that led to this moment. But they weren't at ease with those decisions. They knew they were doing something grievously wrong. They weren't hiding from everyone else. They were hiding from themselves and from the truth which exposes them to themselves. And again, we all have this experience of carrying some burden of shame. We've all done something that if it were broadcast on a screen in front of the whole world, we would hide too. We all have skeletons in the closet. We are all conscious of shame and guilt, which means we all suffer from the condition of self-disapproval. When we measure ourselves, we find that we fall short. We all know what it's like to feel like we should be braver or kinder, more generous, better looking, more adventurous, or more physically healthy. We can imagine everything we ought to be and find that we are not that. The real version of ourselves is one that is incompatible with our own expectations, and we are ashamed for it. And there's no evolutionary advantage to this trait. There's no natural reason for it. We're the only living thing we know of that suffers from this kind of self-dualism, this kind of incompatibility with ourselves and our own judgment. As far as we can tell, no other animals experience shame. And don't point at dogs looking contrite because their owners are scolding them on social media. Those are examples of a human judgment, a human imposition on that animal. That animal is simply responding to the human condemnation and potential punishment, not its own judgment. Were it not for its relationship with human beings who are moral by nature, it would never have given its past conduct a second thought, let alone added shame to it. Because animals are without shame. This is why they're perfectly happy to be naked and completely unaware of that fact, which is to say they give no indication that they disapprove of themselves or that they disapprove of reality and their place within it in general. They are perfectly compatible with the world that they occupy, their environment. That isn't to say that they don't suffer or that they don't have adversity, just that they don't express any incompatibility with the natural world. But we do. We are incapable of simply existing in our birthday suits the way we were brought into the natural world. We have to hide ourselves. We have to decorate ourselves even. We have to insist upon measures of privacy, except for only for our most trusted allies to come into that sacred trusted space. And we see this exemplified in children as well. They don't care to be naked around other people until their proximity to the age of reason increases, and with it, their own sense of moral culpability. Human beings alone find ourselves feeling incompatible with ourselves, with our own nature, and with the world and our placement within it. Almost as if we're haunted by a memory of what we ought to be, or once were and now are not for some reason. And a materialist, atheistic view of reality can't account for this. It can't account for anything other than the brute physical facts of the natural world. Facts which tell us nothing about how the world ought to be, just how it is. And yet we seem to be imbued with an awareness of dimensions of reality that ought to be, but are not, and which have no physical instantiation in space and time. The person we know we ought to be doesn't exist, and yet we still compare ourselves to it as if this standard were so undeniably real and present to our awareness that when we are exposed or compared to it, we run and hide for shame with a kind of fear that motivates us just as much as if we were in actual physical danger. And that's what we saw on the Kiss Cam. So how do we make sense of this? Because if we were mere byproducts of the natural world, it wouldn't make sense that we find ourselves so incompatible with it, so resistant to it, as if we are alien to the natural world, as if we were born or made for another world. The great religions at least have an answer. They do try to make sense of this by offering us creation stories in which we were once in a condition in which we lived in complete harmony with ourselves and the world around us. Christianity calls that original justice. But that by our rebellion against the source of our life, which is God, of course, we ruptured our very will and intellect against our own nature so that we become a living thing that is something of a horror to itself. And while many of the great religions might come close to giving an account of the diagnosis, only one has a real solution, which is that God can remedy our current brokenness. God can remove our shame by entering into the brokenness and shame himself in the person of Christ and entering into the consequences of death in order to defeat it. Now, this video isn't about that, so I'm not going to go into detail about how that works, except to say that no other religion offers us a solution. Islam perhaps comes the closest, along with Judaism and other monotheistic religions and even polytheistic religions, when it says that the solution comes through our own moral effort. But that can't be a remedy for the damage already done. We're already a house divided. How does future moral adherence to the law fix the consequences of what has already been done? And how does it account for the fact that a broken human, by virtue of its brokenness, can't muster up the moral fortitude to obey the natural and divine laws based on every precedent that has come to us historically? That's like going into the hospital after having been shot by a bullet, and they give you a pamphlet that explains how not to get shot, as if preventing getting shot in the future will fix the fact that you're currently bleeding from a bullet hole. And how does that fix the nature of the one who had the susceptibility to injury in the first place as well? It's a complete non-solution to a very serious problem we find ourselves in. Now, I'd also be negligent if I didn't say something about marriage and the shocking disregard our culture pays to what is essentially one of the pillars of civilization, or at least the one that our civilization is built on, which is ironic because on the one hand, we have no-fault divorce. We take full advantage of it too. We say you can't judge people for getting divorced, yet we make an unbelievable spectacle out of these two people for dishonoring this institution. We say things like, if people are in love, they shouldn't be constrained by promises they've made in the past. We say that people shouldn't have to stay in loveless marriages, and that if they find new love, all the power to them. And here we have the protagonists, the embodiment of all those platitudes, who have probably recited those same platitudes back to themselves to justify their behavior. And yet when all the pretenses dropped in a moment of vulnerability, their true moral intuitions on that question are broadcast for the entire world over the internet. And we, in our relentless appetite for intrigue, also can't help but point and blame in direct contradiction of all the bromides we express about tolerance and non-judgment, especially when it comes to the issue of marriage. We also recite slogans like people should be able to do whatever they want in the privacy of their bedrooms without the state or their neighbor interfering. And this has become the foundational premise for the sexual revolution and for not enforcing any kind of sexual ethic in law and for turning a blind eye to things like adultery. All this in spite of the fact that the consequences of divorce, most often precipitated by infidelity, are catastrophic for society. Outcomes for children of divorce are devastating in all the metrics that we tend to look for, things like mental health, academic performance, crime, homelessness, drug use, and on and on and on. These effects, which come from our disregard for marriage as a foundational institution for our civilization, are not negligible, which is why we should do everything we can to uphold and enforce the agreements behind marriage. When we remove reasonable restrictions on morally bad behavior like adultery, we end up overcompensating in episodes like this where the punishment far exceeds the crime. Nobody deserves to be publicly ridiculed and ruined with 8 billion people looking on in judgment for something like this. But they do deserve some kind of consequence, but we've abandoned all such reasonable measures, leaving the mob to decide. And this is the result. And it's a complete double standard. If someone enters into a contract in which money is involved, for example, and then they break that contract, we have no mercy or tolerance for that kind of thing. Justice will be served. So they're going to be legally and financially liable for every measure of commitment that they made. But when two people make solemn public vows to be faithful in marriage and they break those promises, that's fine. We can just break the contract as if it didn't exist because we don't enforce fault when it comes to marriage contracts. Even though monogamy and marriage are so vitally essential for the good of society, there was that famous study done in 1934 by anthropologist J.D. Unwin called Sex and Culture, which, if you want to know more about it, Noelle Mering goes into more detail in her book Awake Not Woke. In it, Unwin studied something like 80 cultures and like 6 civilizations to determine what factors contributed to their flourishing and or downfall. And he discovered that the strongest predictor was liberality with respect to sex. He found that cultures that had customs or laws to ensure monogamy and chastity before marriage had the greatest likelihood to flourish. He found that civilizations that allowed sexual promiscuity collapsed within 3 generations of that permissiveness. And we are now in the 3rd generation since the sexual revolution, and it's no wonder everything seems to be falling apart, which leaves us with 2 choices: continue ignoring the warning signs and holding our foot on the gas pedal as we head towards a cliff, or hit the brakes and return to our moral and religious heritage that made it possible for us to inherit the most advanced and prosperous civilization ever known to human history. If this recent episode tells us anything, it's that instead of repenting and amending our ways, we're making a spectacle out of our own downfall. We'd rather be amused as we drive over the cliff than contrite as we go back in the direction we came to safety and prosperity. Okay, thanks for watching that. If you want to support the work that I'm doing, here's a great way to do so. So if you're moving or buying or selling real estate, contact Real Estate for Life. They have over 1,400 experienced faith-based agents in Canada and the USA, because finding a home isn't something to take lightly, which is why you want to have an advocate who understands your values and can help you achieve those goals. So if you're moving to places like Alberta, where I live, or Texas, or anywhere Catholics are moving to, contact realestateforlife.org. That's realestateforlife.org.